Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Smith with the Unit 1 Renaissance and Exploration Test Review 2020. And I'm simply going to attempt to offer a few ideas to some of these questions that we have on this review. And so the first question is, why is Renaissance an apt name for what began in Italy about 1400? And not to go too much into it, but this was an endeavor to learn from the classics of antiquity to create a new society. And so it was a combination of old and new, a way of using antiquity to getting Europe past the Middle Ages. What important factors made Italy the ideal place for the Renaissance to begin? Well, there were several. There was geography. Italy stuck out into the middle of the Mediterranean, giving it access to other ports all over that sea. There were economic reasons. There was wealth and trade, commerce, the woolen cloth industry, banking, and there was money to invest in art, in culture, and in learning. There were social reasons. Italy was highly urbanized, and there were lots of classical ruins everywhere to remind Italians of where sources of information about how to run a republic might come from. There were political reasons. Northern Italy was made up of independent city-states called communes, and there were wealthy guilds that were providing leadership. They had had bad experiences with the condottieri turning into signori. There was wide participation in government, and there was reverence for the political process, and there was civic pride. What was the significance of the patronage system? Patronage was how Renaissance art was financed. Patrons could be princes, they could be church leaders, they could be wealthy merchants. And the wide variety of patrons led to a wider variety of subjects, styles, and artistic experimentation. So what was the importance of the Medici family to the Renaissance? The Medicis were a wealthy banker family who ruled Florence behind the scenes, and they saw Florence through most of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance flourished under their patronage, and they made notable contributions to civic humanism, including balance of power theory and the idea of the resident ambassador. So why was Cosimo de' Medici important to the Renaissance? He was known as the father of his country, that country being Florence itself. He ran Florence behind the scenes. He was a huge patron of the Renaissance, and he contributed balance of power theory to civic humanism. Why was Lorenzo de' Medici, his grandson, important to the Renaissance? Well, he ran Florence also behind the scenes. He was also a huge patron of the Renaissance, and he presided over the golden age of the Renaissance, and he contributed the resident ambassador to civic humanism. Who were the major Renaissance intellectuals? Well, we're going to mention two here. Of course, as you know, there were many. But one was Lorenzo Valla. Lorenzo Valla was the inventor of a new science called philology, which analyzed the actual textual evidence in ancient texts to find out more information about them. And one of the things he did through his new science of philology was that he examined an old document that the popes had used called the Donation of Constantine. The Donation of Constantine was a document that had supposedly been written by Constantine back in the 4th century, and it gave the Italian popes control of just about all of the Italian peninsula. Lorenzo Valla discovered that this document was actually a fake. You also had Niccolo Machiavelli, and he wrote The Prince about 1519, and The Prince was basically a manual on how to run a government. And the thing about The Prince was it was a humanist book in the sense that it lacked any kind of sense of piety. It didn't deal with how the ideal prince should be. It dealt with the most effective and most efficient way of running a government, and that included being ruthless and feared if you had to. So, Renaissance art. What were some Renaissance values that were expressed in Renaissance art? I like to think it's really all about humanism. And there were three things to identify with regard to Renaissance art. Number one, you did have the value of eloquence and precision of expression. And that led to such things as naturalism, making the subjects of your art look as natural as you possibly could, and using tricks to help you with that. For example, linear perspective, also known as geometric perspective, to achieve a sense of depth. There was using correct anatomy on your subjects, and there was the use of portraiture to capture the unique facial expressions and the unique facial features of whoever you were painting. Another idea behind Renaissance art was secularism, because classical subjects as well as religious subjects were encouraged and accepted. Much of that was because there was more than just the church patronizing the art. There was a wider variety of patrons, including the state, including wealthy merchants. Another factor was humanism. Art became an expression of human individuality through the use of portraits and self-portraits. And it also used emotional expression in the art. And of course, humanism that celebrated humans, you've got to get the human body right. Italian Renaissance versus Northern Renaissance. There were two major differences between the two. The Italian Renaissance was more secular, and it was more individual oriented, whereas the Northern Renaissance was more Christian, and it was much more concerned with improving society, especially the church. The Italian was more concerned with secular classical texts from, for example, the Roman Republic and the Greeks, whereas the Northern was more concerned with classical biblical texts. Now, they did share similarities. For example, both were concerned with the classics. And don't get the wrong idea. To some extent, the Italian Renaissance was concerned about society, and to some extent, the Northern Renaissance was concerned with individuality. Let's talk about the impact of the printing press. Several things there. The printing press, of course, led to an increase in literacy. It also led to an increase in books being published in vernacular language. In other words, the language that people were speaking at home, in their home countries, with their families, with their friends. And because a lot of these works were being published in the vernacular, this led to a sense of national identity, which was going to be more important later. The printing press also increased the dissemination of ideas between people and among people. Books became more affordable, and the printing press spread all kinds of scientific, Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment ideas. Well, let's talk about these new monarchies. What did new monarchs seek to accomplish? And we've talked about this. They sought to accomplish a centralization of their authority and their power. They wanted to strengthen their borders and strengthen their sovereignty. And their two biggest competitors for power were the nobility and the church. Good example of new monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. Some things to think of when you think of Ferdinand and Isabella are things like this: the Reconquista, the Spanish Inquisition, the conquest of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews, the expulsion of the Muslims, and of course, they sponsored and funded Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World. Well, that brings us to the age of discovery. What were the three G's when we're talking about motives for European exploration and expansion, glory, God, and gold. That is not an extensive list of their motives, but those are three big ones. Silver inflation in Spain. Let's explain that for a minute. Let's unpack that. Spain brought about 3.5 million pounds of silver out of the New World. And this influx of silver caused widespread inflation throughout Europe, which had a impoverishing effect because, with inflation that rampant, your life savings suddenly becomes worth a whole lot less. Spain didn't know how to adjust its tax rate to account for this inflation, so it wound up making much less revenue as inflation increased. Silver also paid for the Spanish Armada and for other conflicts that Spain pursued. And in fact, in order to pay for these things, Spain wound up borrowing more money than it actually took in from the silver and wound up defaulting on its debts. Let's describe some of these explorers. What did they do? Why did they do it? And let's begin with Henry the Navigator. And we'll talk about the part that makes him look like a hero. He was a beloved prince of Portugal. He was a Christian knight. He was the conqueror of the city of Ceuta. He set up navigation schools, and he organized and he funded many expeditions down the coast of Africa, meticulously collecting info about wind currents and ocean currents and flora and fauna and people and landforms and map information, etc. He was looking to spread Christianity. He wanted to find the tip of Africa, and he wanted to find this mysterious Prester John person. Well, those are the good things. However, keep in mind we also have the Chronicle of Gomez Llanes de Zurara. He wrote the Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea. He was not an explorer, but a chronicler of exploration. And he wrote a book about Henry the Navigator that was designed to make Henry the Navigator look really good. But it also reveals that Henry the Navigator, during all this time, got extremely wealthy on the slave trade. He brought his entire country into the slave trade. And Gomez Llanes de Zurara came up with a way of justifying it. And basically what he said was this: Henry the Navigator was giving these slaves Christianity, and salvation was much more important to them than anything that they had as free people in Africa. And this was a racist idea that lasted for many centuries. Bartolomeo Diaz, let's not say too much, he was Portuguese, and he's the explorer who actually found the tip of Africa. His information was used by Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama, several years later, was also Portuguese. He sailed around Africa and all the way to India. And he proved that there was a direct trade route by water between Portugal and India, and that the Portuguese could access the Indian Ocean trade network and become quite wealthy as a result. Then we've got Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan was also Portuguese, but this guy was not working for Portugal. He was actually working for Spain. His expedition sailed all the way around the world. It circumnavigated the planet. He himself died in the Philippines, trying to protect his men, actually. And then, of course, we have Christopher Columbus, an Italian. Once again, he was also working for Spain, and he sailed west across the Atlantic and discovered the New World. Expansion. So who was Bartolomé de las Casas, and what did he do? Well, we can say several things to describe him. He was a priest. He was an advocate for the Native Americans. He got the new laws of 1542 passed, and he participated in the Valladolid debate. And those are all in Lesson 14.5. One other thing we want to say about Bartolomé de las Casas is that he had the racist idea that you should bring Africans into the New World and have them do the labor that the Native Americans could not do because they were stronger, more robust, more suited to hard work. He believed that until he actually read De Zarara's book. And after he read that book, he realized that slavery was a horror for anybody, regardless of who was being enslaved. How did European countries react to each other's expansion endeavors? I mean, we've got numerous countries here trying to expand all over the world, expand their wealth and their networks. And you can really sum it up in two words: competition and rivalry. And sometimes this led to all out war. So, where did the center of trade shift to? Who gained and who lost? Well, it shifted from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. So the big winners were the Atlantic countries: Spain, Portugal, France, the Dutch Republic, England. And the big losers were the Mediterranean trading powers like Venice, Genoa, and even the Ottoman Empire. So, what country became the center of economic power? Well, eventually it became the Dutch Republic, with Amsterdam as its capital as well as its commercial hub. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves with that one. What model of economic production began, well, in Brazil, but really with the island of Madeira, and spread all the way all over the Western Hemisphere, with using this model to grow all kinds of different crops? Well, of course, that was the plantation system, powered by slavery. So how did the Portuguese establish an Indian Ocean trading empire? Keep in mind that with regard to the Portuguese, the only land-based portion of their empire was in Brazil. The rest was a trading empire with fortresses along the west and east coast of Africa. Many of these fortresses had been commandeered from the Muslims, and these fortresses were used to protect and supply trading ships, which were sailing back and forth between Portugal and India, or Portugal and Indonesia. So what was the relationship between expansion and these new monarchies that we learned about in Lesson 12.5? Keep in mind that before these new monarchies, Europe was largely feudal, and it was going to be feudal for quite some time. And feudal systems are not really designed to support exploration and expansion. They're too localized, and they're not really set up to raise cash. They're also very rural in nature. In order to fund exploration and expansion and conquest and settlement, kings needed to consolidate power and centralize their authority, to increase their revenue, to expand their bureaucracies, and to enlarge their militaries. And these were the exact things that these monarchs were doing, and these were the exact things that a feudal system is not good at. The conquistadors, who were they? What did they do? How did they do it? And we're really concerned with two in particular. The first one is Hernán Cortés. He defeated the Aztecs. He enlisted the Aztecs' enemies to help him, and he also got a lot of help from smallpox. Second person is Francisco Pizarro. He defeated the Inca. He killed their leader. He plundered their capital, Cusco, and he also had a lot of help from smallpox. Let's talk about technology. And there's two aspects of technology that I want to talk about. And the question is, what technological advances and technological advantages did the explorers, the conquistadors, and the traders have? Well, let's talk about two things. Number one, they had advanced navigational technology. And these technologies included better maps like Ptolemy's geography, the magnetic compass, the astrolabe, the sextant, and of course, who can forget, the caravel. But they also had military technology such as gunpowder, artillery, and even the horse. You can think of the horse as a piece of military technology. And so what did these pieces of technology actually do for them? Well, they allowed the Spanish and the Portuguese to expand global trade and conquest virtually unchallenged for about a century. Describe the impact of conquest and settlement on the New World. And there are several things that we can look at. Number one, you've got the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange was an exchange of just about everything between the New World and the Old World, including plants, crops, animals, people, and ideas, and of course, diseases. One of the big impacts on the New World was Christianity. Christianity was spread by missionaries, and they converted millions of Native Americans to Christianity. And then, as it turned out, Christianity was also quite handy when it came to using it to subdue the people you had conquered. European attitudes towards Native Americans, and we've kind of explored that with our LEQ and DBQ exercise. Some of the attitudes we identified were that Europeans viewed natives as savages, viewed them as slaves, viewed them as heathens, and viewed them as being stupid. So that brings us to Bartolomé de las Casas, because he was an advocate of the good treatment of Native Americans. And so keep in mind what he did. We'd already talked about how he worked very hard to get Native Americans out of slavery. He worked hard to dismantle the systems that were keeping them enslaved. And he also had a massive change of heart close to the end of his career when he realized what a horror slavery was. Before then, as I said before, he had advocated the idea of bringing African slaves to the New World to do the work that he felt that Native Americans were unfit for. After some time, after he read De Zerava's book, he changed his mind. The Dutch Republic. So going back to the Dutch Republic, I had said that they were a major economic power and that Amsterdam was their major trading hub. What trade did they actually control? Well, of course, they specialized in the spice trade in the Indian Ocean, and they had wrested these trade routes from the Portuguese. And what organization did the Dutch use to accomplish their aims? One of their biggest money makers was simply shipping for other people. They shipped for themselves and they shipped for others. And they made massive amounts of money just doing that. Two things that they used to accomplish their aims were, in the Indian Ocean, the Dutch East India Company, possibly the largest company in the history of the world. And they also had the Dutch West India Company. And these companies are described in Lesson 14.4 in some detail. Well, that does it for our review. I hope this helps you, and I hope you ace that test.